In the lawless days of post-Civil War America, the Kansas frontier was a land of opportunity and a place where men could disappear without a trace. The vast prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, swallowing secrets whole. It was here, along the well-traveled Osage Trail, that travelers seeking a fresh start or a fortune in the West would vanish, one by one. Some were missed, others barely noticed. But when a prominent doctor set out on a routine journey and never returned, it set in motion a chilling investigation that would uncover one of the most horrifying crime sprees in American history. The doctor's name was William York, and his fate would lead lawmen to a lonely, wind-beaten cabin in the middle of nowhere, a cabin that reeked of death. And when they pried open a trapdoor hidden beneath the dining table, the horror that lay beneath would haunt them forever. Labette County, Kansas, in the early 1870s was a kind of place where civilization clung by a thread. The Osage Trail, a well-worn route used by homesteaders, outlaws, and drifters, cut through its heart like a scar. Small settlements dotted the land, but beyond them, the prairies stretched wild and untamed. There were no laws, no rules, only survival. It was here that the Bender family arrived in 1871. They were German immigrants who spoke little English, but they knew how to blend in. John Bender Sr. was an imposing man, his face as weathered as the land. His wife, known only as Ma, was a hulking woman with piercing eyes and a foul temper. Their son, John Jr., had a strange, unsettling laugh and often spoke nonsense. But it was the daughter, Kate Bender, who drew the most attention. Young and striking, Kate claimed to have psychic abilities and advertised herself as a spiritual healer. She held seances for curious travelers, promising to communicate with the dead for a price. Together, the Benders built a small one-room and along the Osage Trail. It was a simple wooden cabin, split into two sections by a tattered canvas curtain. The front half served as a general store and dining area for weary travelers. The back half was where the family lived. Behind the house stretched an orchard, its soil dark and rich. It was said the Benders had the best apples in Kansas. But something about the family wasn't right, and soon the disappearances began. The first travelers to vanish were barely noticed. A drifter here, a lone settler there, people who had no family to come searching for them. But as the months passed, the missing persons reports began to pile up. One of the earliest recorded victims was George Lonker, a man traveling with his infant daughter to Iowa. He was last seen on the Osage Trail, heading toward Labette County. When months passed without word, his friends began to worry. Then came Henry Mackenzie and Ben Brown, two men traveling separately who both disappeared along the same stretch of road. And then, in March 1873, Dr. William York set out in search of a missing acquaintance. He was a respected man, a former military surgeon and well-connected. When he failed to return, his brothers, Colonel Ed York and Senator Alexander York, launched a full-scale investigation. Their search led them to a strange little inn along the Osage Trail, the last place their brother had been seen alive. When Colonel York arrived at the Bender home, he was met with warm smiles. The family expressed concern for his missing brother, claiming they had seen nothing unusual. Kate Bender, with her piercing eyes and honeyed words, even offered to hold a seance to help locate the missing doctor. But something about the family set Colonel York on edge. The father, John Sr., barely spoke, his heavy-lidded eyes watching him closely. John Jr. laughed at odd moments, as if he were in on a private joke. And Ma Bender scowled from the corner, her fingers twitching as if eager to grab something. York and his men left without evidence, but he made a promise to return. 2 days later, a neighbor noticed something odd. The Bender cabin was abandoned. The animals were still in their pens, hungry and bleeding, but the family was gone. Inside the house, the table was still set as if the Benders had been expecting guests. And then someone noticed a strange, discolored patch of floorboards beneath the dining table. When the sheriff pried it open, the room filled with a sickening stench. Below the floor, in a shallow, dark cellar, lay a pool of congealed blood. But there were no bodies. Not yet. The search moved outside, where the Benders' orchard stretched across the land. The soil was freshly disturbed in places. With grim determination, The men grabbed their shovels and began to dig. What they found turned their stomachs. Dr. William York lay buried in a shallow grave, his skull crushed, his throat slit. Then another body was unearthed, and another, and another. By the end of the day, 10 corpses had been exhumed. Some were barely recognizable, their faces twisted in agony. Among them was George Lonker, his arms wrapped protectively around the tiny skeleton of his infant daughter. The pattern became clear. The Benders had a method. They would invite travelers inside, offer them food, and seat them at the dining table, positioned directly over the hidden trapdoor. As their guests relaxed, their back to the canvas divider, one of the Benders would strike with a hammer, crushing their skull. Another would slit their throat to finish the job. The body would then be dropped into the cellar and later buried in the orchard. The motive? Greed. The victims were robbed of their money and possessions before being discarded like waste. But the Benders were gone. A massive manhunt swept across Kansas. Some claimed the family had split up and fled in different directions. Others believed vigilantes had caught and executed them in secret. Rumors persisted for decades. Some said Ma Bender had been arrested under an assumed name but was never confirmed. Others swore they had seen Kate Bender working as a psychic in another town. But the truth? No one ever saw the bloody Benders again. And as the sheriff looked at the last grave, something caught his eye, a patch of disturbed earth just beyond the orchard. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he reached for his shovel. He dug once, twice, and then the tip of his spade struck something solid, something wooden. And that's when he noticed the smell of freshly dug earth, and something else, something rotten. The sheriff's hands trembled as he cleared away the last of the dirt, his heart pounding in his chest. The stench rising from the disturbed soil was putrid, thick, suffocating, and unmistakable. He had unearthed body after body in the Benders' orchard that day, but this was different. His spade had struck something wooden, not another shallow grave, not another decomposed corpse, but a crate large enough to hold something, or someone. The men gathered around, lanterns casting flickering shadows across the freshly dug pit. With a deep breath, the sheriff reached down and pried open the rotting lid. As it would splinter apart, the group took a collective step back. Inside lay a skeleton, curled into a fetal position. But unlike the other remains, this one had been wrapped carefully in old, moth-eaten cloth, as if it had been laid to rest with something resembling care. The bones were older than any of the Benders' other victims. And then someone gasped. Pinned to the fabric was something unexpected, a rusted locket. Inside, beneath the grime and decay, was a portrait of a young woman, a woman who looked eerily familiar. It was Kate Bender, or at least someone who looked exactly like her. The discovery of the buried crate sent shockwaves through the investigation. The sheriff and his men had been uncovering victim after victim, all brutally slaughtered and discarded, but this was different. Who was this person? And why had they been buried with such care, while the others were tossed away like garbage? Word spread quickly, and before long, a flood of people arrived at the Bender homestead. Local townsfolk, outlaws, bounty hunters, and reporters eager to get a glimpse of the infamous murder farm. The York family, still grieving for Dr. William York, demanded immediate answers. But the more authorities searched for the truth, the murkier the case became. A former neighbor claimed he had once seen Kate Bender speaking in hushed tones with an unfamiliar woman, someone who had the same sharp features, the same piercing eyes. He had assumed it was a distant relative. But now, looking at the locket's portrait, he wasn't so sure. Another traveler, a fur trapper who had passed through months earlier, swore he had seen Kate Bender twice. Once at the inn, and once, on the same day, in a neighboring town nearly 20 miles away. Was it a case of mistaken identity? Or had there been two Kates all along? And then there was the missing evidence. A local shopkeeper stepped forward, recalling that just days before the Benders vanished, a woman had arrived in town, claiming she was Kate's cousin. She had bought large amount of food and supplies before disappearing just as quickly as she arrived. But when asked to describe her, the shopkeeper hesitated. "She looked just like Kate," he finally muttered. "Could have been her twin." But Kate Bender didn't have a twin. Did she? A week after the mass graves were discovered, a new piece of evidence surfaced, one that threw the entire case into chaos. A tattered, yellowing envelope had been slipped under the sheriff's office door in the dead of night. No one had seen who delivered it. There were no footprints in the dirt outside. No witnesses. Just a letter, waiting on the wooden floor like an unwanted ghost. With wary hands, the sheriff unfolded the parchment. The ink was smudged, as if written in haste. It read, "You are digging in the wrong place. There are more of us than you know. We will never be caught. We will never be found. This is only the beginning." There was no signature, no clue as to who had written it. But the sheriff knew one thing for certain. It wasn't written by the Benders, because by then, the Benders were long gone. With the Benders on the run, and no clear answers, law enforcement scrambled to piece together what little evidence they had. Reward were offered for any information. Posters with the Benders' faces were nailed to trees and saloon walls, but no credible lead surfaced. Theories ran wild. Some believed vigilantes had already caught and executed the family in secret. Others swore the Benders had fled west, changing their names and disappearing into the endless frontier. Then, something happened that changed everything. A former bounty hunter named Samuel Tuttle arrived in Labette County with an unbelievable story. He claimed that weeks earlier, while traveling through Texas, he had overheard a drunken man boasting about the Benders. The man claimed to have been paid to help them escape. According to Tuttle, the stranger rambled about how the Benders weren't just a family, but part of something bigger, a group operating across multiple states, moving from town to town, setting up shop under new names, and leaving bodies in their wake. They weren't the first, the man had slurred, and they sure as hell won't be the last. Before Tuttle could get more details, the man sobered up and refused to speak another word about it. But the implications were chilling. Had the Benders been part of something much larger? Were there others like them, waiting, watching? And if so, where would they strike next? Just when it seemed the case had hit a dead end, a final clue emerged, one that sent a new wave of terror through Labette County. A farmer nearly 30 miles away had been repairing his fence when he stumbled upon an abandoned wagon stuck in the mud. Inside were scattered belongings, clothes, empty food tins, and an old, worn-out Bible. The name inscribed inside the cover, John Bender Sr. It was the first concrete sign that the family had passed through the area after their escape. But where had they gone from there? As the sheriff examined the abandoned wagon, something else caught his eye. Near the base of a tree, just beyond the fence line, a pile of leaves had been disturbed. He approached cautiously, brushing them aside with the toe of his boot. Beneath them was a shallow hole, barely a foot deep, and inside it, a severed human hand. Fresh, not rotted like the others, not buried months ago. This body had been dumped within the last week, which meant one thing. The Benders, or someone just like them, were still out there, still killing, still watching. And as the sheriff straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow, a feeling of dread crept over him, because in the distance, carried by the wind, came a faint, eerie sound. A woman's laughter, light, musical, and hauntingly familiar. The sheriff's breath hitched as he turned toward the sound. Soft, lilting laughter that carried through the trees like a ghostly whisper. It was distant, almost playful, but there was something wrong about it. Something unnatural. The deputies stiffened, hands tightening around their rifles as they scanned the darkened horizon. The vast Kansas prairie stretched out before them, empty and silent, except for the wind. Then the laughter stopped. The sheriff swallowed hard, tried to push away the nagging sense of unease. The severed hand at his feet was still fresh, the blood only just beginning to congeal. Whoever had left it here hadn't gone far. "Check the area," he barked, snapping his men into action. Whoever did this might still be close. The deputies spread out, lanterns flickering as they combed through the underbrush. The prairie grass rustled in the wind, casting long, shifting shadows. Then, just as one of the men took a step forward, crack! A hidden tripwire snapped. There was a sharp whistle in the air, and in the blink of an eye, a rusted hunting knife came flying from the darkness. The deputy barely had time to react before the blade buried itself in the wooden fence post beside his head. Silence. No movement. No sound. Whoever had set the trap had vanished into the night. But one thing was clear. The Benders, or someone just as monstrous, were still hunting in Kansas by sunrise. The sheriff had ordered a full-scale search of the surrounding area. Bloodhounds were brought in, but the trail turned cold only a few miles out. The abandoned wagon, the severed hand, the laughter in the dark, it all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. The Benders hadn't just fled, they had kept killing. Then, just as the search seemed fruitless, a breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A farmhand from a neighboring town had overheard two strangers whispering about the Benders in the back of a saloon the night before. One of the men, an old drifter with a jagged scar down his cheek, had muttered something chilling. They never left, just changed their names. The farmhand had dismissed it as drunken rambling until he heard about the severed hand found in the field. Now he wasn't so sure. The sheriff demanded to know where the drifter had gone, but the farmhand hesitated. He was real spooked, the boy admitted. Said he knew something but was too scared to talk. Took off toward the old railway station. That was all the sheriff needed to hear. Within the hour, he and his men were riding hard toward the station. The railway station was nothing more than a rickety wooden shack, the kind of place where men passed through without leaving a trace. But the sheriff spotted the drifter immediately, hunched in a corner, nursing a flask with shaking hands. Samuel Tuttle, the sheriff said, recognizing the bounty hunter who had first warned them about the Benders' escape. You have something to tell me. Tuttle looked up, his eyes hollow and bloodshot. He glanced around nervously before leaning in close. They ain't dead, he whispered. I seen him. At least I seen her. Who? The sheriff pressed. Kate. Tuttle nodded. Or someone who looks just like her. I was passing through a town near the Texas border, and there she was, smiling, Logan, selling healing potions like she always did. The sheriff's jaw tightened. You're sure? Tuttle exhaled shakily. She looked right at me, like she knew I knew, and then she smiled. The sheriff's blood ran cold. But before he could ask more, Tuttle grabbed his wrist with a vice-like grip. There's something else, he rasped. Something worse. The sheriff braced himself. What? Tuttle swallowed hard, as if he didn't want to say it aloud. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered. They weren't working alone. The word sent a chill down the sheriff's spine. Before he could press further, a sudden noise cut through the air, a distant train whistle, followed by the heavy thud of boots against wooden planks. Tuttle flinched. They're here, he hissed. They're watching me. Panic flashed in his eyes. Without another word, he shoved past the sheriff and bolted toward the back exit. The sheriff started after him. Bang! The gunshot rang out like a thunderclap. Tuttle stumbled forward, blood blooming across his chest. He hit the ground hard, gasping. By the time the sheriff spun around, the shooter was gone. But in the fading light of the platform, something fluttered near Tuttle's lifeless hand. A small, yellowing scrap of parchment. The sheriff bent down and picked it up. There were only 4 words, scrawled in uneven ink. You should have left it. Back in Labette County, the sheriff locked his office doors and stared at the note, heart pounding. Tuttle had been silenced, but by whom? The Benders? Or someone protecting them? And if Tuttle had been right, if the Benders weren't alone, who else was out there? A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. One of his deputies stood outside, his face pale. We found something, the deputy muttered, back at the Bender homestead. The sheriff followed him without a word. It was near the orchard, where the first bodies had been dug up. The earth had settled, the graves long emptied. But now, another hole had been unearthed. The sheriff's stomach turned as he saw what lay inside. A single wooden mask, cracked and rotting, resting on a pile of human bones. Not one mask, 3. A shiver ran through him. The Benders had worn no masks. They had no need to hide their faces, which meant these belonged to someone else. Someone who had been there before them. Someone older. The sheriff's mind reeled as he took a step back. Had the Benders been part of something much larger? Had they inherited this place, this method of murder? Had this land been a killing ground for longer than anyone realized? And then, as the wind howled through the trees, something strange happened. A lantern flickered, and from deep within the orchard, barely audible beneath the rustling leaves, came the unmistakable sound of digging. The sheriff stood frozen at the edge of the Bender homestead, his breath shallow as the unmistakable sound of digging drifted through the wind. The discovery of the wooden masks had shaken him to his core, proof that whatever horrors had taken place here predated the Benders. But this was something worse. Who was out there, still clawing at the earth, unearthing the past? One of his deputies took a cautious step forward, rifle raised. "Who's there?" he called out. The digging stopped. The sheriff's fingers curled around the grip of his revolver, his pulse pounding in his ears. Silence pressed down on them, thick and suffocating. Then a gust of wind kicked up dust and leaves, revealing something that sent a chill racing down his spine. There were fresh footprints leading into the orchard. Boot prints, deep, recent, and they weren't alone. Smaller prints ran alongside them, bare feet, as if someone had been dragged into the trees. A flicker of movement, a shadow shifting between the gnarled branches. Then the laughter returned. Faint, female, playful, and much closer this time. By morning, the sheriff's discovery had spread like wildfire. The legend of the Benders had already been enough to keep folks awake at night. But now, the entire county was in frenzy. Had the Benders returned, or had they never really left? Theories spiraled out of control. Some believed Kate Bender was haunting the land, her ghost digging up old graves in search of vengeance. Others insisted the Benders had been part of a secret cult, one that had merely found new recruits. One thing was certain, the town was terrified. And then, as if confirmed the worst fears, people started disappearing again. A traveling salesman named Milo Watts vanished just outside Labette County. His horse was found tied to a post outside a general store, but Milo was nowhere to be seen. A widow in a nearby town reported that her young daughter had gone missing from her bed overnight. The window left open and footprints in the dirt outside. And then came the message. A farmhand arrived at the sheriff's office, his face pale as he handed over a blood-stained scrap of parchment. It read, "The earth remembers its own." Beneath it was a single symbol, a crude carving of a wooden mask. The sheriff clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about the Benders anymore. This was something much older, and it was still alive. Determined to uncover the truth, the sheriff gathered his most trusted men and returned to the Bender homestead under the cover of night. Lanterns flickered as they stepped into the orchard, the soil uneven beneath their boots. The sheriff's hand never strayed far from his revolver. The digging had stopped, but the fresh graves remained. Some were shallow, some deep, but all of them, every last one, had been dug in the same unnatural shape. Circular, ritualistic. "Jesus," one of the deputies muttered. What the hell were they doing out here? The sheriff didn't answer. His eyes locked onto something half buried in the dirt. He crouched, brushing away the soil, and revealed a set of bones. But they weren't human. They were animal skulls, arranged in a perfect ring. And at the very center, nestled in the dirt like some unholy offering, a severed human tongue. The sheriff barely had time to react before the silence shattered. A scream, high, agonized, and close. It came from the trees. Without thinking, the sheriff sprinted forward, gun drawn. His men followed, their lanterns swinging wildly. The orchard twisted around them, branches reaching like skeletal fingers. Then, just ahead, something moved. A figure, tall and thin, wrapped in a tattered cloak, was watching them. For a single, frozen moment, the sheriff locked eyes with it. The figure's face was hidden behind a wooden mask. Then it turned and ran. "After him!" the sheriff roared. The chase was on. The masked figure darted through the trees, impossibly fast. The sheriff's lungs burned as he pushed himself forward, the pounding of boots behind him echoing through the night. Branches snapped, underbrush tore at his clothes, but he never took his eyes off the figure. Then suddenly it stopped. The figure stood at the edge of a deep ravine, shoulders rising and falling with ragged breaths. The sheriff skidded to a halt, revolver trained on its back. "Turn around," he ordered. Slowly, the figure obeyed. The wooden mask was crude, its edges splintered and darkened with age. But beneath it, a pair of familiar, piercing eyes glowed in the darkness. The sheriff's blood ran cold. It was Kate Bender, or someone who looked exactly like her. She tilted her head, that unsettling smile playing at her lips. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. "Who the hell are you?" the sheriff demanded. "The Benders are dead." Her smile widened. "Are they?" And then, before the sheriff could react, she reached up and pulled off the mask. The sheriff's breath caught in his throat, because it wasn't Kate Bender at all. It was someone older, someone whose face matched the locket they had found in the crate, someone who had been buried under the Bender house all along. Before he could fire, she threw herself backward into the ravine, gone, swallowed by the abyss. The sheriff and his men rushed to the edge, their lanterns straining against the darkness. But when they looked down, there was no body, only a wooden mask, resting on a pile of human bones. And somewhere, deep within the ravine, the laughter began again. The sheriff never found the woman's body. They searched the ravine for days, combing through the tangled underbrush and jagged rocks, but there was nothing. No broken bones, no torn fabric, no sign that she had ever hit the ground. Only the wooden mask, resting atop a pile of bones. And that was enough to unsettle even the most hardened men, because the mask, the same crude design they found buried near the Bender homestead, was older than a family of killers who had lived there. Much older. The sheriff had come looking for the last of the Benders. Instead, he had uncovered something far worse. Despite the mystery in the ravine, the sheriff returned to town with the evidence he did have. The fresh graves, the animal skulls, the severed tongue, and the eyewitness accounts of mass figure. The Kansas authorities wasted no time. They officially reopened the Bender case, reigniting the manhunt that had long gone cold. Rewards were posted, bounty hunters swarmed the region, and newspapers across the country churned out sensational headlines. "The Butchers of Labette has one of the Benders returned?" "Mass phantom stalks Kansas. The ghost of Kate Bender?" "Cult cannibalism or curse? What lies beneath the Bender farm?" Soon, claims and confessions poured in. A woman in Montana, arrested for fraud, swore she was Kate Bender and that she had survived all these years under a false name. A pair of aging sisters in Texas, both former spiritual healers, were accused of being Ma and Kate Bender in disguise. A man in Colorado wrote a deathbed confession, claiming he had been a boy when his father helped the Benders escape, ferrying them west in exchange for their silence. But none of these leads amounted to anything. DNA testing did not exist. Official records were scarce. And so, one by one, the cases were dismissed. The Benders, whether dead, escaped, or something else entirely, remained ghosts. As time passed, the facts blurred with folklore. Some said the Benders had fled to the frontier, vanishing into lawless territories where no one dared to follow. Others believed they had changed their names, blended into new communities, and continued killing in secret. And then there were those who whispered something darker, that the Benders had never been human to begin with, that they had been something else. There was a reason, after all, that no one could ever quite explain where they had come from. No one knew their real names. No one could trace their history before they appeared in Labette County. And the wooden masks, always left behind, always watching, suggested they had belonged to something older than Kansas itself. Even in modern times, the Bender homestead remains cursed. The land has never been successfully resettled. Farmers who have tried claim their crops wither overnight, that their animals refuse to go near the old orchard. Hikers have reported seeing figures standing among the trees, their faces obscured by rotting wooden masks. And travelers passing through the area, especially those who stopped near the old trails where the Bender and one stood, have spoken of a woman's laughter on the wind, soft, playful, and always too close. The bloody Benders were among America's first documented serial killers, but they would not be the last. What is it about places like this, remote, quiet, isolated, that seem to breed darkness? What is it about human nature that allows for such evil to take root? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, if the Benders were merely one chapter in a much older story, who came before them? And are they still out there? The bloody Benders may have disappeared from history, but their legend refuses to die. Their story serves as a grim reminder of how easily monsters can hide in plain sight, smiling, welcoming strangers into their home, only to turn hospitality into horror. Their crime shook a nation still recovering from the Civil War, exposing the dangers of the lawless frontier and forcing communities to reconsider how justice was enforced in the West. Their murders helped shape early criminal investigations, inspiring the creation of wanted posters, bounty hunting laws, and organized manhunts that would become standard practice in tracking fugitives. And yet, despite these efforts, the Benders were never caught. Were they simply cunning enough to evade justice? Or did they belong to something older, darker, and more secretive than anyone could comprehend? To this day, travelers who pass through Labette County speak of the strange silence that lingers over the land where the Benders once lived. Some report hearing whispers near the abandoned trails, while others claim to have seen shadowy figures standing beneath the dead trees. No matter how much time passes, one question remains unanswered. Did the Benders escape justice? Or is their evil still waiting to be uncovered?